You ever have a moment in your life where everything just stops? Like time itself holds its breath, waiting to see what you'll do next? That moment when you realize nothing will ever be the same again. That moment came for me 2 years ago. 2 years, and I still feel it, still taste it, still hear it. It was late. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. I was standing under the shower, hot water running over my skin, steam curling around me like a ghost. I wasn't thinking. Or maybe I was thinking too much. I had spent so many nights feeling empty, so many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering when my life had started slipping away. I was 44. A wife. A mother. A woman who had spent the last 20 years giving, sacrificing, folding parts of herself into smaller and smaller pieces so everyone else could be whole. And yet, in that moment, standing in that shower, I felt more naked than I ever had in my life. Then I heard it. A soft knock at the bathroom door. A familiar voice. "Mom, are you okay?" My stomach twisted. A simple question, right? An innocent concern. But why? Why did my body react the way it did? Why did my breath catch in my throat? I should have told him to go back to bed. I should have ignored it. I should have done a lot of things. But instead, I turned. And that night in the shower, it changed everything. I wish I could tell you that was the first time something felt off. That before that night, before that knock on the door, everything was normal. That I was just another mother, another wife, living an ordinary life. But that would be a lie. The truth is, the cracks had been forming for years. Long before that shower. Long before the silence between me and my husband became so thick, I could barely breathe through it. I was 44. A woman who had once been full of life, full of dreams. And now? I was just someone's wife. Someone's mother. Someone's afterthought. Our house wasn't small, but it felt empty. Not in the way that houses feel when the kids grow up and move away, no. This emptiness was different. This was the kind of emptiness that existed even when people were home. The kind of silence that sat heavy in the air, pressing into the walls, stretching into every room. During the day, I kept busy. Cleaning, cooking, running errands. It was almost like I was trying to convince myself that if I just kept moving, I wouldn't feel it, the loneliness. But at night, it was impossible to ignore. I'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at the clock, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. Sometimes I'd pour myself a glass of wine, just one, just enough to take the edge off. Just enough to dull that ache inside my chest. My husband, he used to come home late. Work, always work. He was successful, powerful, well-respected. And me? I was just the woman who kept everything in order so he could be all those things. We used to talk. Used to laugh. Used to touch. But those things faded so slowly, I didn't even notice they were disappearing until one day, I realized we had become strangers. Now, our conversations were practical. Mechanical. Did you pay the electricity bill? What time is the plumber coming? There's food in the fridge. Never how are you? Never I miss you. Never I love you. At first, I thought I was just imagining it. That I was being dramatic. But deep down, I knew. I knew. And then, the signs started showing up. Late nights at work turned into weekends away. His phone, always face down. The cologne that wasn't his. The text messages he never answered in front of me. I never caught him. Never had proof. But you don't need proof when your gut is screaming the truth at you. He was cheating. I knew it. And worse than that? I knew that if I confronted him, he'd probably just shrug and say, "So what?" I wanted to leave. I thought about it all the time. But then I'd look at my son. And I'd stay. My son. He was my only source of warmth in that house. At 22, he wasn't a child anymore, but he wasn't quite a man either. He still had that softness about him, that kindness that made him different from his father. He was observant, always had been. While his father barely noticed me anymore, he did. "Mom, are you okay?" He'd ask, his voice gentle. "You seem off." I'd laugh it off. Say I was just tired. But he never let it go. He was always watching, always checking in, always stepping in when his father wouldn't. If I was carrying groceries, he'd rush to help. If I sighed too loudly, he'd ask what was wrong. If I sat too long in silence, he'd just be there, not saying anything, just keeping me company. I don't know when I started depending on that, when his presence became my only comfort. But once I realized it, I was already in too deep. It happened so gradually, I didn't even notice it at first. Little things. The way he lingered when we talked. The way he always found an excuse to touch my shoulder, my hand, to sit just a little too close. The way I let him. The way I needed him to. At first, I told myself it was nothing. That he was just a good son, a caring son. But the truth was, I had never felt so alone. And when someone reaches out to you in the dark, even if it's not the person they should be, sometimes you take the hand that's offered. Even when you know you shouldn't. It was a Sunday. My husband was away, like always. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when my son walked in. He leaned against the counter, watching me. Want some help? I smiled. I got it. He didn't leave. Didn't move. Just stared. Mom, can I ask you something? I turned off the faucet, drying my hands. Of course. He hesitated, like he was trying to find the right words. Are you happy? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth, closed it, swallowed. What could I say? Yes? That would be a lie. No? That would be too honest. I don't know, I finally admitted. I don't think I've thought about it in a long time. He nodded, looking down, like he had expected that answer. And then, so softly I almost missed it, he said, I just want you to be happy. Something in his voice made my breath hitch. Because in that moment, I wasn't sure he meant it the way a son should. And worse? I wasn't sure I heard it that way either. I should have seen it then. Should have stopped it. Should have done something, anything, before it got worse. But I didn't. Because for the first time in years, someone was looking at me like I mattered. And I wasn't ready to let that go. And that's how it started. That's how the lines started to blur. That's how I found myself standing in the shower that night, knowing, deep down, that everything had already changed. And once you cross a line like that, there's no going back. If I had to pinpoint the exact moment, the one where things really started to shift, it would be that day at the beach. That one rare, stolen afternoon where, for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself laugh. I let myself feel. It was a simple idea. My son suggested it. Come on, Mom, let's get out of the house. You never do anything for yourself. He wasn't wrong. I couldn't even remember the last time I had gone anywhere that wasn't the grocery store, the dry cleaners, or the pharmacy. And of course, my husband, well, he was too busy. He barely looked up from his laptop when I asked if he wanted to come with us. Maybe next time, he muttered, already checked out of the conversation. Except there was never a next time. There hadn't been in years. So it was just me and my son. The air was warm, thick with the scent of salt and sunscreen. The waves crashed rhythmically in the distance, families scattered across the sand, laughing, playing, living. And for the first time in a long time, I felt young. We waded into the water, the cool waves wrapping around our legs. He splashed me, grinning like he was 10 years old again. I shrieked, laughing, pushing water back at him. I don't remember the last time I had laughed like that. The kind that makes your chest ache. The kind that makes you forget, even if just for a second, all the things weighing you down. And then, just for a second, our eyes met. He was looking at me. Not in the way a son looks at his mother. Something in my stomach twisted, but I ignored it. Shook it off. Told myself I was imagining things. But I wasn't. And I knew it. The sun had set by the time we got back into the car. My hair was still damp, the scent of the ocean clinging to my skin. He drove in silence, his fingers tapping absently on the steering wheel. I could feel it. The shift. The weight of something unspoken sitting between us. I wanted to say something, to crack a joke, to pull us back into the comfort of what we used to be. But the words wouldn't come. So I stared out the window instead, watching the streetlights blur past us. When we finally pulled into the driveway, he turned to me. His eyes flickered over my face, lingering for just a second too long. "You had fun today?" His voice was soft. I swallowed, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I did." The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, but there was something unreadable in his expression. Something I couldn't or didn't want to name. Back home, I stepped into my bedroom, peeling off my swimsuit, wrapping myself in a towel. My skin was still flushed from the sun. As I walked past the mirror, I paused. I don't know why. I guess I hadn't really looked at myself in a long time. There I was. The same body that had carried a child, had been touched and then untouched by a man who once swore he loved me. The lines around my eyes were deeper now, my collarbones more pronounced. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. And that thought alone sent a shiver down my spine. Then, a knock at the door. Soft, hesitant. "Mom?" My breath caught in my throat. I tightened my grip on the towel. My heart was hammering, but I didn't know why. "Yeah?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. There was a pause. A long one. Then, "Just wanted to check on you." I should have told him I'm fine. I should have told him go to bed. I should have told him this isn't right, whatever this is becoming. But instead, I opened the door. He was standing there, fresh out of his own shower, his damp hair curling at the edges. His t-shirt clung to him slightly, his jaw tight like he was fighting with something inside himself. Our eyes met. And we didn't look away. Not immediately. Not the way we should have. It was a second. Maybe two. Maybe less. But time stretched in a way that made it feel like forever. I saw something in his eyes. Something that scared me. Something that thrilled me. Something that I should have never seen. And worse? Something that I should have never wanted to see. He cleared his throat first, breaking the silence. "Okay. Good night, Mom." His voice was normal. Too normal. I nodded quickly, stepping back. "Good night." He turned, walking away, his footsteps fading down the hallway. I closed the door. Leaning against it, my breath shuddered out of me. I told myself I imagined it. That it was nothing. That it was exhaustion, or the remnants of a long day, or maybe just a fleeting moment that meant nothing. But my body knew better. I could still feel the heat of his gaze. The weight of it. The wrongness of it. And worse, I could feel the way my own body had responded. I stood there for a long time, fingers gripping the edge of the counter, staring at my own reflection. And for the first time since all of this began, I was afraid. Because I knew. I knew something had already started that I didn't know how to stop. I wish I could say I forgot about that night. That after I closed the door, after I pulled my robe tighter around me, after I forced myself into bed, it faded into nothing. But it didn't. It clung to me, wrapped itself around my mind like a vine, creeping into every quiet moment, every breath, every stray thought. I told myself it was nothing. A passing moment. A trick of my own loneliness. But my body knew better. And the worst part? I wasn't the only one who felt it. For days after, I tried to act normal. I woke up early, made breakfast, went about my routine as if nothing had shifted. But I felt it. Oh, I felt it. The way my son's eyes lingered on me just a second longer than before. The way his hand brushed mine when I set a plate in front of him. The way he always found a reason to be near me. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was reading into things that weren't there. He was my son. My son. He was just being caring. He saw how his father treated me, how invisible I had become in my own marriage. He was trying to make up for it. That's all it was. That's all it had to be. So I ignored the way my stomach tightened when he looked at me with those knowing, searching eyes. I ignored the warmth in my chest when he laughed at something I said, the way my husband hadn't in years. I ignored the way my skin felt alive when he was around, how my body suddenly seemed to remember it was still a woman's body, not just a mother's. And I told myself over and over again, this is nothing. It's just in my head. It doesn't mean anything. But for him, it wasn't nothing. I started noticing it in the little things. He began watching over me like a protector, as if he had decided that since his father wouldn't, he would. At first, it was subtle. Small gestures. Pouring me a cup of coffee before I even asked. Offering to rub my shoulders after a long day. Staying up late just to keep me company when he should have been in bed. Then, it was more. A lingering hand on my back as he passed behind me in the kitchen. The way he hugged me, not a quick, casual embrace, but something deeper, longer. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. Like I was fragile. Like I was his. And I let him. Because deep down, I wanted to. It became routine. He'd find me at night, sitting at the kitchen table with my glass of wine. I wasn't sleeping much anymore. Not after that night. Not after realizing how much I had felt something I wasn't supposed to feel. And he never went to bed before I did. It started with conversations. At first, they were innocent. We talked about small things. Movies. Music. The way the house felt too quiet when his father was gone. But then, it became more. Secrets slipped between us like whispers in the dark. I told him things I shouldn't have. I told him how lonely I felt. How I sometimes wondered if his father had ever really loved me at all. How I wished that I could feel seen again. And he listened. He saw me. It was small at first. A hand over mine as I spoke, squeezing gently. A thumb brushing against my wrist as he took my empty wine glass. A touch to my knee when he reassured me, voice low, steady. And each time I felt it. Like a live wire under my skin. I told myself it was nothing. That I was imagining it. But the way he looked at me? The way his breath hitched ever so slightly when I leaned in too close? The way he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before pulling away? I knew. He knew. It was late. Past midnight. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the TV playing in the background. I wasn't really watching. I was just existing. He came in, fresh from a shower, his hair still damp, his t-shirt hanging loose over his frame. He sat beside me. Close. Closer than usual. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then, so softly I barely heard it, "Mom, are you happy?" I swallowed. Turned my head, meeting his gaze. I should have lied. Should have laughed it off. But instead, my voice came out quieter than I expected. No. The word hung between us. And I felt him move, just slightly, just enough for his knee to press against mine. For a second, neither of us breathed. And then, his fingers brushed over my hand. Not accidentally. Not casually. Intentionally. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped it. But I didn't. Because in that moment, with my husband gone, with the weight of years of neglect pressing down on me, with my heart screaming for something, anything, to remind me I was still alive, I didn't want to. And the worst part? For the briefest, most fleeting second, I don't think he wanted to either. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't stood up just then. If I hadn't forced a breath into my lungs, pulled the blanket tighter around me, muttered a quick "I should go to bed." I don't know if he would have stopped. Or if I would have let him. But I do know one thing. That night as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my skin still burning where he had touched me, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts, I knew we had stepped too close to something dangerous. Something irreversible. And I knew. If I wasn't careful, if I didn't stop this now, we were going to cross a line. One that we could never come back from. I should have put a stop to it then. I should have seen where it was leading, how the ground beneath us was shifting in a way that couldn't be undone. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I didn't want to. It started subtly. Little moments. Barely noticeable at first. A hand on my lower back as he passed behind me in the kitchen. The way his fingers would graze my wrist when handing me something. The way his eyes lingered when I wasn't looking. And me? I let it happen. Because his touch wasn't like his father's, cold, indifferent, distant. His touch felt deliberate. Felt like I mattered. And that was something I had gone too long without. It was small things at first. Bringing me coffee in the morning, just the way I liked it. Offering to rub my shoulders after a long day, the warmth of his palms pressing into my skin a little longer than they should, filling the void that my husband left so effortlessly, so thoughtlessly. One night, I stayed up later than usual, absent-mindedly rubbing my temples as I sat at the dining table. Without a word, he came up behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. "You're always so tense," he murmured, fingers kneading gently. I closed my eyes. I should have stopped him. I should have laughed, brushed it off, said moms don't get massages from their sons. But I didn't. Because in that moment, with my husband somewhere miles away, doing God knows what with God knows who, I wanted it, needed him. It was after a fight. Another argument that led nowhere. Another night of screaming into the void, my husband barely looking up from his phone, his voice detached, unaffected. "Why are we even still doing this?" I had asked, voice shaking. "Do you even care anymore?" He didn't answer. Just looked at me, sighed, and walked away. And that was somehow worse than if he had yelled. Worse than if he had called me names. Because it meant I wasn't even worth the energy anymore. I stood there in the silence of our bedroom, staring at the walls, my chest rising and falling too fast, my fingers clenched into fists. And before I even realized where I was going, I was knocking on his door. "Mom?" His voice was groggy, thick with sleep. He was sitting up before I could say anything, his eyes adjusting in the dim light of his bedside lamp. And then he saw my face. And the way his expression shifted, concerned, protective, soft, was enough to break me completely. My voice cracked. "I don't want to be alone right now." He didn't hesitate. He just lifted the blanket, wordlessly inviting me in. And I should have said no. Should have turned around, walked back to my room, locked the door, and forced myself to fall asleep. But instead, I stepped inside. The bed was warm, the space between us too small. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then, so softly I barely heard it, "You deserve better than this." His voice, low, deep, full of something unspoken. My breath hitched. I turned my head, met his gaze in the dim light. The way he was looking at me. I should have looked away. But I didn't. I couldn't. His hand lifted, hesitant, unsure, but still, it rose. A thumb brushed against my cheek, catching a stray tear. His fingers lingered. And the way my skin burned under that touch. I knew that if I let this moment stretch any further, if I didn't move, if I didn't breathe, something would happen. Something that couldn't be undone. And then I did move. Jerking back, just slightly. Just enough. His hand dropped instantly, and he swallowed, hard, looking away. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. And finally, voice hoarse, barely above a whisper, I muttered I should go. But I didn't move. Not right away. Because something inside me, something dark, something desperate, wanted to stay. And that scared me more than anything else. I should have left his room that night and never looked back. I should have slammed the door between us, buried whatever this thing was before it could breathe, before it could become something living, something real. But some things, once set in motion, have a way of unraveling on their own. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, tried to shove it back into the dark corners of my mind where dangerous thoughts belong, it was already too late. The rain started in the afternoon, thick, heavy droplets slamming against the windows, rattling the house with every gust of wind. The kind of storm that makes the walls feel smaller, the air feel heavier. I was restless. I had been all day. Every movement felt too slow. Every thought felt too much. I didn't know what was wrong with me. Or maybe I did. Maybe I just didn't want to name it. The house was quiet. My husband was away again. I needed to clear my head, to scrub away the thoughts that had been suffocating me all day. So I turned on the shower, let the steam rise around me, stepped under the hot water, and closed my eyes. For a moment, I let myself pretend that I was just a woman. Just a body, warm and alive and unburdened. Pretend that I wasn't losing my mind. Pretend that I wasn't craving something I shouldn't. But then a knock. Soft. Hesitant. My breath caught. I told myself I imagined it. But then again. And a voice. His voice. Mom? I should have ignored it. I should have stayed silent. But instead, without thinking, without breathing, I whispered, "Yeah." A pause. "Are you okay?" I swallowed. My throat was dry. My skin was burning, not from the heat of the water, but from something else entirely. I reached for the shower knob, hesitating. "I'm fine," I lied. I don't know if I meant for him to hear it or for myself. But then, the door creaked. And my stomach dropped. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned, water running down my face, and there he was standing in the doorway. He didn't move. He just stood there. His gaze unreadable. His chest rising and falling too quickly. The steam wrapped around us like a secret, like a confession, like a mistake waiting to happen. I should have screamed. Should have pushed him out, slammed the door shut, never spoken of this again. But instead, I just stared back. And he didn't look away. Not immediately. Not the way he should have. I don't know how long we stood there. A second? An eternity? But in that moment, I felt it. Something shift. Something snap. Something I could never, ever take back. His fingers twitched at his sides. His lips parted, like he was about to say something, and then reality slammed into me. I gasped, stepping back so fast that I nearly slipped. My hands flew to my chest, gripping myself as if I could shield away the truth, as if I could erase what had just happened, what had almost happened. "Get out," I choked. He froze. I saw it. The hesitation, the confusion, the pain, and then he blinked. Like waking up from a dream. Like realizing where he was, who he was. "Mom, get out." My voice broke. And this time, he did. He turned and left. The door shut. And I was alone. Water still running. Heart still racing. But I wasn't the same. I would never be the same. I don't know who I was in that moment. I don't know what we were in that moment. But I know. I was never the same after. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own skin. Like the woman I used to be had vanished the night before, slipping down the drain with the water, leaving behind someone I didn't recognize. Someone I didn't want to recognize. I moved through the house like a ghost. Every step felt wrong. Every breath felt borrowed. I told myself not to think about it. Not to remember the steam, the heat, the way his eyes held mine for just a second too long. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That nothing really happened. But the weight in my chest said otherwise. And when I walked into the kitchen and saw him standing there, his back to me, his shoulders tense, I knew he felt it too. He didn't turn around when I entered. Didn't say good morning. Didn't look at me. That was when I knew. Everything had changed. I stood there for a long time, staring at his back, trying to find words that didn't exist. Finally, I cleared my throat. "You didn't have to wake up so early." My voice was too casual, too light, like I was trying to erase the night before by sheer force of will. He stiffened. And for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was unreadable. Like he didn't know how to look at me. Like he didn't know who I was anymore. "I have somewhere to be," he mumbled, grabbing his keys from the counter. And just like that, he was gone. It wasn't just that he left. It was how he left. No lingering glance. No hesitation. Like he was running from something. Like he was running from me. And for the first time since this all started, I felt it, the loss. I had spent so long drowning in my own loneliness, so long craving something, anything to fill the void my husband left behind. And then, just when I had found something warm, something real, it was slipping away. And it was my fault. He came back late that evening. Walked through the front door like he always did, setting his briefcase down with the same thoughtless motion, his tie already loosened. "Did you eat?" I asked, out of habit. He nodded, barely looking up. "Had a meeting. Grabbed something there." I stood there, watching him. Waiting. Hoping, though I didn't know for what. Maybe for him to ask how I was. Maybe for him to look at me the way my son had the night before. But he didn't. He just walked past me, kissing my cheek out of routine. Not feeling. And in that moment, something inside me twisted so violently, I almost gasped. Because for years, I had thought the worst thing my husband ever did was neglect me. But now I knew the truth. The worst thing he ever did was make me stop wanting him. And for that, I had betrayed him in ways he would never know. It wasn't just avoidance. It was distance. Physical, emotional, he was pulling away in every way a person could. He stopped staying up late with me. Stopped making quiet conversation over breakfast. Stopped touching me. No more brushes of his fingers. No more warm hands on my shoulder. It was like he was building a wall, brick by brick, between us. And I hated it. Not just because it hurt, but because I deserved it. Because I knew, deep down, he wasn't pulling away because he hated me. He was pulling away because he didn't trust himself. And that was worse. A week passed. 7 days of silence stretching between us like an ocean too wide to cross. Until finally, one night, I heard it, the sound of his car starting in the driveway. I looked out the window, watching the taillights disappear into the dark. And I knew. He was going to someone else. Someone younger. Someone less complicated. Someone who didn't carry the same wrongness in their touch. And as I stood there, staring at the empty driveway, feeling the weight of my own choices settle into my bones, I realized something. I had spent all this time craving connection. And now I was more alone than ever. Because when you cross a line, when you almost cross a line like that, there's no way back to who you were before. Only who you are now. And I didn't know who I was anymore. They say guilt is like an anchor. Once it latches onto you, it drags you down. I didn't know how deep it would take me. I thought I could just move on, that time would wash it away like a tide erasing footprints in the sand. But time wasn't kind to me. And every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that shower. Back in that moment. And I asked myself over and over again, was it my fault? Or was I something worse? I had spent so much of my life convincing myself I was a good person. A good wife. A good mother. A woman who had sacrificed, who had given until there was nothing left. So why did I do it? Why did I let it happen? I could blame my husband, blame the years of neglect, the coldness, the way he made me feel invisible. But was that really an excuse? Or was I just trying to paint myself as a victim so I wouldn't have to admit the truth? Because the truth was uglier. The truth was that I wanted something I wasn't supposed to want. That I let the loneliness grow inside me like a sickness, let it fester, let it twist me into someone I didn't recognize. And when the moment came, when the water was hot, when the air was thick with something I refused to name, I didn't turn away fast enough. I let the seconds stretch. I let the one exist. And that was the part one couldn't forgive. I stood in front of the mirror, tracing the lines on my face with shaking fingers. For the first time, I didn't see a wife. I didn't see a mother. I saw a woman who had done something unforgivable. I saw someone weak. Someone selfish. Someone who had blurred the lines until they no longer existed. I whispered, "Who are you?" But the mirror didn't answer. Because I already knew. I was no longer the woman I thought I was. I was something else now. Something I couldn't take back. And no matter how many times I washed my hands, scrubbed my skin raw in the shower, tried to scrub away the memory of his touch, I couldn't erase the truth. Because the truth? The truth was inside me. And it wasn't going anywhere. I wish I could say it never happened. I wish I could erase that night from my mind. But some things once seen can never be unseen. Some moments, once they exist, never really leave you. They become a shadow, a stain, something that clings to your skin no matter how many times you try to wash it away. I have spent nights staring at the ceiling, asking myself the same questions over and over again. Was it my fault? Did I let it happen? Or did I want it to? The worst part? I don't know the answer. And I think that's what haunts me the most. Have you ever been in a situation where loneliness made you question yourself? Where the lines between right and wrong started to blur? Where your own emotions twisted into something you didn't recognize? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Tell me if you've ever felt that emptiness, that craving for something more. Tell me if you've ever found yourself staring at a line you never thought you'd cross. And if this story shocked you, if it made you feel something, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this This is just one of many stories. One of many secrets buried in the dark. Loneliness is dangerous. It makes you see things that aren't there. It makes you crave things you shouldn't. It makes you believe things. Things that feel real in the moment, things that seem harmless, things that whisper promises in the silence of an empty house. But those things? They can destroy you. They can take everything you thought you were and twist it into something unrecognizable. No matter how lost you feel. No matter how much you want to be seen, to be held, to feel wanted again. Don't let yourself cross a line you can't come back from. Because once you do, there's no going back. Because some sins can never be washed away.